For most of human history, we were not alone. There were multiple kinds of human on this planet at the same time. Not apes, not distant ancestors. Other humans, living, adapting, surviving in their own environments. Now there is only one. They are all gone, every single one, and the reason why is not as simple as one species replacing another. Because some of them were not weaker. Neanderthals had larger brains than us. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years. Our species has existed for only a fraction of that time. At one point, our entire population may have dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals, small enough to disappear, and yet we did not. We spread, and we did not do it alone. A small percentage of human DNA today comes from species that no longer exist as separate populations, which means we did not just replace them, we met them, we lived alongside them, and the boundary between them and us was not always as clear as it seems now. For thousands of years, multiple human species shared the same regions. Then, one by one, they disappeared. Not all at once, not in a single event, but in a pattern that repeats across continents. That is where the uncertainty begins, because if strength, intelligence, and survival time were enough, we would not be the last one standing. Something else determined the outcome, something less obvious and possibly accidental. In tonight's journey, we go back to that world where we were not the only humans and try to understand how it became a world where we are. Long before a single lineage carried the name human across the entire planet, the story unfolded as a wide and branching presence spread across continents and climates, unfolding over nearly 2.8 million years. What is now called Homo sapiens occupies only the final 300,000 years of that span, a brief closing movement in a much older and more varied composition. In eastern Africa, around 2.4 million years ago, Homo habilis shaped the first known stone tools. The flakes they struck from rock were simple but deliberate, edges designed to cut and separate. Their brains were smaller, roughly half the size of ours, yet their hands carried intention, a quiet beginning that marked a shift in how life could interact with the world. From that foundation emerged Homo erectus, a species that did not remain in one place. They moved outward, across landscapes that stretched far beyond Africa, reaching what is now China and Indonesia. They endured for nearly 2 million years, an almost unimaginable continuity. Fire became part of their existence, not just a force to fear, but something to hold and use. Their tools grew more refined, symmetrical hand axes shaped with a sense of balance that suggests foresight and repetition across generations. Between these early wanderers and later forms stood Homo heidelbergensis, present in both Africa and Europe. They hunted large animals with wooden spears, coordinated efforts that required timing and shared understanding. Within them lay the branching point that would give rise to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, a quiet divergence that would shape everything that followed. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals adapted to cold environments over hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies carried the imprint of Ice Age conditions, their lives shaped by landscapes that demanded endurance. They were not isolated or simple. Evidence of care, craft, and symbolic behavior traces through the places they occupied, leaving behind a record of complexity that unfolds slowly in the ground. Across Asia, another presence existed, known now as the Denisovans. Their physical remains are scarce, a few fragments preserved in a cave, yet their genetic imprint reveals a population that ranged widely, far beyond what those fragments alone would suggest. Their story is carried not through bones, but through inheritance that still persists. On isolated islands, evolution followed different paths. On Flores, a small-bodied species, Homo floresensis, lived for hundreds of thousands of years, standing just over a meter tall. They used tools and hunted animals much larger than themselves, sustaining a stable existence in a confined world. Nearby on Luzon, Homo luzonensis left traces of a form that does not fit neatly into any single lineage, a mosaic of features that resist simple classification. In South Africa, Homo naledi presents another variation, with a small brain, yet evidence suggesting deliberate placement of their dead in deep cave chambers. The behavior hints at intention beyond immediate survival, an action that carries weight even without full explanation. None of these beings were incomplete versions of something else. Each was fully formed within its own environment, shaped by pressures and possibilities specific to the places they inhabited. They endured not for brief moments, but for spans of time that stretch far beyond the existence of our own species so far. The world they occupied was not empty space waiting to be filled. It was already inhabited, already active with lives unfolding in parallel. What remains today is not the continuation of all those paths, but the survival of one, moving forward alone through a landscape that was once shared. Set the moment far back around 100,000 years ago, and imagine a quiet assessment made without hindsight. Among the human forms present then, the outcome would not seem uncertain. One lineage stood rooted in its environment, with a depth of time and adaptation that appeared almost unshakable. The balance of evidence would lean toward the Neanderthals, not as a marginal contender, but as the most established presence across their world. Their bodies carried a design shaped by long exposure to cold climates. The rib cage expanded outward in a rounded form, holding warmth close. Nasal passages were broad and structured to temper frigid air before it reached the lungs. Limbs remained compact, reducing the surface through which heat could escape. This was not a temporary adjustment, but a sustained refinement, built across hundreds of thousands of years in landscapes defined by ice and shifting seasons. Inside the skull, volume reached an average of 1,600 cubic centimeters, exceeding that of Homo sapiens. The difference was not trivial. Brain size does not map simply to intelligence, yet it reflects a capacity shaped by evolutionary pressures that demanded precision, memory, and awareness in environments where small errors carried consequences. Their nervous system developed within conditions that required constant calibration to danger, movement, and opportunity. Muscle and bone reveal another layer. The points where tendons attached to their skeleton show repeated strain, the kind produced by heavy exertion. Arms and shoulders suggest strength comparable to trained athletes of the modern world. Their daily lives involved force applied directly, close to the body, without mechanical advantage. The marks left in bone are quiet records of repeated effort, sustained over entire lifetimes. Their encounters with large animals were not distant. Injuries preserved in their remains resemble those seen in close contact with powerful prey, fractures and impacts that healed over time. Survival after such events indicates resilience, but also familiarity with risk that was faced again and again. Hunting was not an abstract task, but a direct engagement, requiring coordination, timing, and physical commitment at the edge of danger. Yet the outline of their lives does not rest only in strength. Across their territories, traces of deliberate behavior accumulate. In Shanidar Cave, individuals were placed in the ground with care, bodies arranged rather than discarded. Pollen gathered around one burial suggests the presence of specific plants, some known for medicinal properties. Whether carried intentionally or gathered by circumstance, the pattern reflects attention beyond immediate survival. Elsewhere, at Krapina in what is now Croatia, eagle talons bear marks of modification and wear, shaped into objects that carried meaning beyond utility. These appear tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens reached the same regions. Pigments such as ochre and manganese dioxide appear across multiple sites, substances that do not alter function but transform appearance, hinting at symbolic expression. On cave walls in parts of Spain, markings dated to at least 65,000 years ago trace patterns and forms created long before other human groups arrived. The process used to determine these ages, based on the slow accumulation of minerals, places the activity firmly within Neanderthal time. The surfaces they marked remain still, holding gestures that were never meant to last but did. Their tools reveal planning that extends beyond immediate action. Stone points were fixed onto wooden shafts using birch tar, produced by heating bark in conditions with limited oxygen. This required controlled steps carried out in sequence, knowledge passed from one individual to another across generations. It is a quiet chemistry, practiced without written language, preserved through memory and repetition. Care within their groups appears in individuals who lived with severe injuries. One man from Shanidar survived into later adulthood, despite a withered arm, damage to one eye, and other impairments that would have limited independent survival. His continued life implies sustained support from others, an ongoing investment in individuals who could no longer contribute in the same ways. All of this forms a picture that does not align with simplicity or failure. It suggests a population deeply integrated into its environment, physically capable, behaviorally complex, and established across vast spans of time. In the summer of 2008, deep within the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a small fragment of bone was lifted from the sediment floor of Denisova Cave. It was unremarkable at first glance, a piece no larger than a grape, worn smooth by time. It carried no obvious distinction, no clear indication that it belonged to anything beyond the familiar fragments already known. Yet the cave itself preserved what the open world often erases. Its cold, steady conditions held the structure of the bone intact in ways rarely seen. From that fragment, researchers were able to extract ancient DNA. The sequence that emerged did not match Neanderthal, nor did it align with Homo sapiens. It traced a lineage that had never been identified before. In 2010, the findings were published, revealing a branch of the human family tree that had remained completely unknown, discovered not through a complete skeleton or a skull, but through a child's finger bone and a single tooth. The tooth found alongside the fragment carried its own quiet anomaly. Larger than expected, it did not fit within the known range of either Neanderthal or modern human teeth. Its proportions suggested a population distinct in form, yet there were no additional remains to anchor that difference in a full physical presence. What followed was a reconstruction built almost entirely from genetic patterns, a species defined less by shape and more by inheritance. Years earlier, in 1980, a jawbone had been recovered from a cave on the Tibetan plateau, sitting at an altitude of roughly 10,000 feet. For decades, it remained without clear classification, housed in a monastery, its identity unresolved. Only in 2019 did protein analysis link it to the same lineage as the Denisova fragment. The bone itself dated back at least 160,000 years, placing this population in environments where oxygen levels fall thin and survival requires specific adaptation. From these scattered remains, a wider presence begins to emerge. Genetic traces indicate a distribution stretching across much of Asia, from Siberia through Southeast Asia and into the islands of the Pacific. The physical evidence remains minimal, yet the genetic signal extends across vast distances, suggesting populations that moved and adapted across varied landscapes. Within Denisova Cave itself, another fragment added a further layer. In 2018, Analysis revealed that one bone belonged to a young individual whose ancestry was divided between Neanderthal and Denisovan. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father Denisovan. The boundary between these groups, once thought to be distinct, appears more permeable when viewed through this lens of direct inheritance. That inheritance continues into the present. Populations in regions far from the cave carry Denisovan DNA in measurable amounts. Among Aboriginal Australians, between 4 and 6% of the genome traces back to this lineage, a higher proportion than anywhere else. In Tibet, a specific gene variant, known as EPAS, one allows the body to function at high altitude without the complications that affect most humans. This variant originated from Denisovans and remains active in millions of people living on the plateau today. In Melanesian populations, a second Denisovan signal appears, genetically distinct from the first, indicating that multiple Denisovan groups interacted with Homo sapiens at different times and in different regions. These encounters left behind fragments that continue to circulate through living populations long after the original groups disappeared. The contrast remains quiet but striking. A species known from only a handful of physical remains, yet present in the genomes of hundreds of millions of people. Their bodies are largely absent from the ground, but their biological influence continues to move through living systems. What they were in full form remains mostly unseen, but their presence persists in a distributed and enduring way, carried forward without recognition. Beneath a ceiling of stone on the island of Flores, layers of earth held a form that did not match expectation. When it was uncovered in 2003, the proportions suggested something unfinished, a small body that seemed closer to childhood than maturity. Yet the details told a different story. The bones had completed their growth, the teeth carried the marks of years, and the structure belonged to an adult who had lived within a body no taller than 1 meter. The individual was not alone. As excavation continued within Liangbua Cave, additional remains appeared, each sharing the same scale and proportions. This was not a singular case, but a consistent population, later named Homo floresiensis. Their form did not align with known variations of Homo sapiens, nor did it reflect a developmental condition. It represented a stable outcome, shaped over long periods within the boundaries of an island. Life on Flores unfolded under conditions that differed from those of larger land masses. Resources were limited, and the absence of large mammalian predators altered the pressures that guide survival. Over many generations, smaller bodies require less energy, allowing a population to persist where larger forms would struggle. This process, often seen in isolated environments, gradually shifts size downward, producing species that appear reduced when viewed outside their context, yet remain fully adapted within it. Across the cave floor, stone tools appeared in large numbers. Flakes shaped with deliberate strikes formed edges suited for cutting and processing. Their presence indicates continuity, a repeated method carried across generations. These tools were not incidental but central to survival, used with consistency and familiarity. Among the animals that shared the island was Stegodon, a smaller relative of elephants, yet still substantial in size. Evidence suggests that Homo floresiensis hunted these animals, likely through coordinated effort. The difference in scale between hunter and prey required planning and cooperation, carried out with bodies that appear slight but were sufficient within the conditions of that environment. The surrounding ecosystem included forms that would seem unusual elsewhere. Large storks moved through open areas, while rodents reached sizes rarely seen beyond island systems. Komodo dragons occupied the role of dominant predator, capable of taking prey far larger than themselves. Within this setting, Homo floresiensis maintained a presence that endured for hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by a balance that remained stable over time. Their timeline extends until approximately 50,000 years ago. This period aligns with the movement of Homo sapiens into the broader region, though no direct evidence of interaction has been preserved within the cave. The record shows proximity in time rather than overlap in place, leaving the relationship between these populations unclear. Stories carried by later inhabitants of Flores describe small beings dwelling in forested areas, moving quietly and sometimes approaching human settlements. These figures, known as Ibu Gogo, are described as small, covered in hair, and capable of simple communication. The resemblance to the physical traits suggested by the fossils has drawn attention, though the connection remains uncertain and unverified. Further north, on the island of Luzon, another discovery emerged in 2019. Teeth and fragments of hand and foot bones found in Calo Cave revealed a different population named Homo luzonensis. These remains date between 50,000 and 67,000 years ago. Their anatomy does not follow a single lineage, combining features associated with Homo erectus alongside traits seen in much earlier hominins. Both island populations developed along paths shaped by isolation, each responding to local conditions over long spans of time. Their forms reflect solutions that differ from those found elsewhere, sustained within environments that allowed such variation to persist until those conditions shifted beyond what their adaptations could support. Numbers remain long after motion has passed. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, Mount Toba released a volume of material that exceeds nearly every eruption known within the past 2 million years. The event was not part of the ordinary range of volcanic activity. It belongs to a category defined by scale, where the quantity of matter reshapes conditions far beyond the immediate site. The eruption expelled roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash, gas, and fragmented rock. To frame that volume, a later eruption at Mount Street, Helens in 1980 released about 1 cubic kilometer. The difference is not incremental, but exponential, a multiplication that shifts impact from regional to continental. If spread evenly, the material from Toba could cover a landmass the size of the continental United States under several feet of ash. Another reference lies beneath North America, where the Yellowstone system remains active. Its largest past eruptions approach similar magnitudes. Yet to match Toba's output would require multiple events occurring in sequence. The comparison highlights not only size but rarity, as events of this scale do not occur frequently within geological time. In the immediate phase, pyroclastic flows moved outward from the eruption site. These currents of superheated gas and debris traveled at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, carrying temperatures sufficient to destroy all biological material within their reach. The zone closest to the eruption became uninhabitable almost instantly, altered at a pace that leaves little trace of what existed before. Beyond that initial radius, the effects extended upward into the atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere, forming aerosols that reflected incoming solar radiation. This change reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the surface, initiating a period of global cooling. Average temperatures are estimated to have dropped between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius, with certain regions experiencing declines of up to 15 degrees under specific conditions. The cooling persisted for a span of 6 to 10 years, though the full duration remains uncertain. During this interval, reduced sunlight affected photosynthesis across large portions of the planet. Plant life, which forms the base of most food systems, declined in productivity. As vegetation diminished, the animals dependent on it followed. creating a cascade that moved upward through ecological layers. A continuous layer of ash from this eruption has been identified across multiple regions, including India, the Arabian Peninsula, the Bay of Bengal, and parts of East Africa. These areas correspond to locations where early Homo sapiens populations were present at the time. The deposition of ash in these regions indicates that the effects of the eruption reached far beyond its origin, influencing environments separated by vast distances. Genetic data provides another perspective. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineage, shows a marked reduction in variation corresponding to a period between 70,000 and 75,000 years ago. This pattern suggests a contraction in population size, a narrowing of genetic diversity that aligns in time with the Toba event. Not all evidence supports a single, global collapse. At Pinnacle Point, on the southern coast of Africa, archaeological layers show continuous human occupation through this period, with no clear interruption in tool use or habitation. This continuity indicates that some regions maintained conditions that allowed survival, even as other areas experienced significant disruption. The current understanding places the eruption as one factor among several pressures affecting human populations at the time. It may not have acted alone, but it likely contributed to conditions that reduced numbers to levels far below previous ranges. At its lowest point, the number of breeding individuals may have fallen to fewer than 1,300. Fewer than 1,300, not a crowd, not a region, but the number of individuals capable of sustaining the future of an entire species. This figure does not describe all who were alive, but those who could pass life forward, the narrow line through which everything that followed had to pass. Placed against the present, the scale becomes easier to see. The population of Luxembourg stands at around 660,000, a number hundreds of times larger than that fragile threshold. A single modern university campus can hold more students than the number of breeding humans that once existed across the entire planet. The continuity of every future generation rested within a group smaller than what now fills a few clustered buildings. Within that small population, the full range of human possibility was compressed. Every skill, every variation, every potential path forward existed only in limited form, held within a network of individuals whose survival depended on conditions that could not be controlled. The genetic future of all who would come later remained suspended within that narrow span, carried by those who endured long enough to reproduce. The evidence for this reduction does not come from a single source. It emerges through patterns preserved in DNA. Mitochondrial sequences, inherited through maternal lines, allow researchers to trace backward through generations, mapping how variation narrows at certain points in time. The Y chromosome offers a parallel path through paternal lines, providing an independent measure. Beyond these, the broader genome, carried across both parents, reveals additional layers of ancestry. When these lines are compared, they converge on a period of significant contraction beginning around 100,000 years ago and reaching its lowest point near 70,000. A study published in 2023 estimated that the number of breeding individuals may have fallen to approximately 1,280, remaining at that level for a prolonged duration extending over many thousands of years. The exact figures remain under discussion, yet the pattern of reduction is consistently observed. Population genetics provides a framework for understanding what such numbers imply. In the short term, A population of about 500 breeding individuals is often considered the lower boundary for avoiding immediate inbreeding effects. Over longer periods, a number closer to 5,000 is needed to maintain genetic flexibility and adaptability. The estimated population during this bottleneck may have fallen below both thresholds, placing the species within a range where survival was not guaranteed. The consequence of that contraction remains visible today. Human genetic variation is unusually limited when compared to other primates. Two chimpanzees from the same forest in West Africa can differ more from each other at the genetic level than any two humans separated by continents. This relative uniformity reflects a shared origin within a small group, a narrowing that left a lasting imprint. What persisted through that period was not defined solely by physical strength or cognitive capacity. Survival depended on combinations of traits that aligned with specific conditions. Behavioral flexibility, the ability to shift between food sources, and patterns of cooperation that allowed small groups to remain stable under stress, all contributed. Geography also played a role, as some regions provided resources that others did not during times of environmental strain. The individuals who carried these traits forward did not represent a complete spectrum of what had existed before. They were a subset, shaped by circumstance as much as by ability. Within them, certain patterns continued, while others ended, leaving a lineage that reflects both persistence and loss, carried quietly into every generation that followed. Some places do not change as quickly as the world around them. While surrounding regions shift, collapse, or lose stability, a few narrow zones continue to hold enough balance to sustain life. These areas are known as refugia, sheltered environments where food and conditions remain steady even when broader systems begin to fail. Along the southern coast of Africa, near what is now Mossel Bay, one such region persisted through a period when many others did not. The coastline around Pinnacle Point offered a combination of features that allowed small human groups to remain in place while conditions elsewhere became increasingly difficult. This was not a matter of abundance, but of consistency, a quiet reliability that did not disappear when larger ecosystems faltered. A cold ocean current, the Benguela Current, flows along this stretch of coastline. It moderates temperature, preventing extreme fluctuations that affected inland areas. While other regions experienced sharper drops or unpredictable variation, this coastal band remained comparatively stable, maintaining conditions that supported both plant and animal life. At the edge of the sea, the intertidal zone provided a source of food that did not rely on large game or complex hunting strategies. Shellfish, mussels, limpets, and sea urchins could be gathered directly from the shoreline. These organisms reproduce quickly and remain available regardless of changes inland. They offer concentrated sources of protein and fat, accessible with minimal tools, allowing small groups to sustain themselves even when other food systems declined. Beyond the shoreline, the surrounding landscape contains an exceptional variety of plant life. The Cape Floristic region holds one of the highest concentrations of plant species per unit area on the planet. This diversity provided a range of edible resources, ensuring that food did not depend on a single source. When one type became scarce, others remained available, creating a layered system of support. Evidence from Pinnacle Point shows that humans occupied this region continuously for long periods, extending through the time associated with major environmental disruption. The archaeological record does not show a break in habitation. Layers of discarded shells accumulate over time, indicating sustained reliance on marine resources. The continuity suggests that the conditions necessary for survival remained intact, while other regions experienced greater instability. Further along the same coastline, at Blombo's Cave, pieces of ochre have been found bearing engraved patterns, dated to around 75,000 years ago. These markings appear during the same general period, indicating that symbolic behavior persisted alongside daily survival. The presence of such objects suggests that life within these refugia was not reduced solely to subsistence, but retained forms of expression and shared meaning. Other regions may have served similar roles. The Horn of Africa, with access to both the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, provided marine resources under different conditions. The Nile corridor offered fresh water and consistent ecological support independent of broader terrestrial changes. In parts of East Africa, higher elevations created localized climates that remained cooler and more stable during periods of warming elsewhere. Survival within these refugia was not random. It depended on the specific combination of geography, climate, and available resources. The individuals who remained in these zones were situated in places where small populations could be sustained through extended periods of environmental stress. Their continued presence reflects not only endurance, but alignment with conditions that allowed endurance to be possible. Within these sheltered environments, human groups persisted while much of the surrounding world shifted. The stability they found did not isolate them from change, but it provided a foundation from which change could be absorbed rather than resisted. Across multiple sites, separated by distance, a quiet shift appears in the record between roughly 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. The materials themselves do not change suddenly, but the way they are used begins to follow patterns that had not been present before. Objects start to carry marks that serve no direct function, and tools begin to show a level of refinement that suggests new ways of thinking about time and intention. At Blombo's Cave in South Africa, pieces of ochre bear engraved cross-hatched lines arranged with care into repeating geometric forms. These markings do not assist in cutting or scraping. They do not alter the physical properties of the material. Their purpose exists beyond immediate survival, reflecting the ability to impose pattern onto matter for reasons that extend beyond utility. Nearby, shells from Nassarius kraussianus appear altered and transported inland. They are pierced, often stained with pigment, and found far from the shoreline where they originated. Their presence suggests movement over distance and a role that exceeds basic function. When worn or carried, such objects indicate awareness of appearance and the recognition that others can perceive and interpret it. Stone tools from this period also show a change in method. Still bay points, shaped through careful pressure flaking, exhibit a level of precision that requires sustained practice. The process involves controlled removal of material, guided by knowledge of fracture patterns and tool design. This is not a technique learned quickly. It implies extended teaching, where one individual transfers skill to another across time. Alongside stone, bone begins to be used more frequently as a material for tools. Awls and points fashioned from animal remains reflect an understanding of different structural properties, selecting materials based on how they respond to force and shaping. This choice indicates flexibility in thinking, the ability to recognize that different substances offer different possibilities. Raw materials also appear at locations far from their natural sources. Obsidian and silkrete, traced back to origins hundreds of kilometers away, suggest movement that extends beyond immediate surroundings. Whether through exchange between groups or planned journeys, This pattern reflects the ability to maintain goals over extended periods, carrying intention across distance and time. Taken together, these traces point toward changes in behavior that extend beyond the practical. The creation of patterns on ochre indicates abstract thought, where meaning is applied rather than derived from direct use. The presence of decorative objects suggests awareness of identity, both personal and shared, and the capacity to signal that identity within a group. The transmission of complex tool-making techniques implies structured learning, where knowledge is not only retained but deliberately passed forward. This continuity allows skills to accumulate rather than reset with each generation. Planning over long distances indicates a capacity to hold future outcomes in mind, acting in the present toward goals that are not immediately visible. Two broad explanations have been proposed to account for this shift. One suggests a biological change, a mutation affecting language or cognitive processing that enabled a step increase in mental capacity. The other points to gradual accumulation, where cultural knowledge built over time reached a level that allowed more complex behavior to emerge. The evidence does not clearly favor one explanation over the other. What remains consistent is the appearance of a behavioral pattern that had not been present in earlier records, emerging across different regions within a relatively narrow span of time. The populations that moved beyond their original regions after this period carried these patterns with them. Wherever they went, the same forms of expression and tool use appeared, indicating that this way of thinking had become embedded, shaping how they interacted with the world and with each other. A narrow stretch of water separated two landmasses, and at some point between 70,000 and 65,000 years ago, a small group moved across it. The crossing itself left little trace, no preserved footprints or vessels, only the genetic continuity that follows afterward. From that moment, a path opened that would extend far beyond its origin. The number of individuals involved was not large. Genetic models suggest that the population giving rise to all non-African humans consisted of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 people, possibly fewer. Within that limited group, the full lineage of billions who would live later was contained, carried forward through generations that expanded outward from a single movement. The route followed the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, tracing coastlines that no longer exist in their original form. At that time, sea levels were lower by approximately 80 meters, exposing broad sections of continental shelf. What is now submerged once formed continuous land, creating a corridor that extended along the coast from Arabia into South Asia. The evidence of this passage remains sparse, as much of the route now lies beneath the ocean. Movement along this path appears to have occurred with unexpected speed. Fossil and genetic data place Homo sapiens in South Asia by around 65,000 years ago, indicating that the expansion unfolded over a relatively short period. From there, populations continued eastward, reaching regions that required navigation across open water. The arrival in Australia, estimated at approximately 65,000 years ago, reflects a step beyond land-based travel. Even with lower sea levels, crossings of at least 90 kilometers were required. These were not accidental drifts, but deliberate movements, involving the use of watercraft capable of carrying multiple individuals across distances where no land was visible from the point of departure. The combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, known as Sahul, was reached by around 50,000 years ago. Establishing a population there required not only arrival but continuity, a transfer of enough individuals to sustain reproduction and maintain a presence across generations. The journey implies planning, coordination, and knowledge of movement across unfamiliar environments. As these populations moved outward, they entered regions already inhabited by other human species. Neanderthals occupied parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were present across Central and Eastern Asia. On islands further south, Homo floresiensis lived within their established range, while Homo luzonensis existed in the Philippines. The landscape was not unoccupied, but shared among multiple human forms, each adapted to its own conditions. The expansion of Homo sapiens into these areas introduced a new presence into existing systems. Encounters occurred over time, sometimes leaving traces in genetic records, sometimes leaving none. The overlap between populations extended across thousands of years, creating a period in which different human species lived within the same, broader regions. Within approximately 25,000 years of this initial crossing, the pattern changes. One by one, the other human populations disappear from the record. The timing varies by region, but the sequence remains consistent. The world that had held multiple human lineages becomes a world defined by one. The crossing itself did not contain that outcome within it. It marked the beginning of a movement, a shift in distribution that brought one population into contact with others across a wide geographic range. What followed unfolded gradually, shaped by interactions that left uneven traces, but together produced a transformation that remains visible in the absence that came after. For a time, two kinds of human moved across the same ground, leaving traces that settle into the same layers of Earth. The overlap was not brief. In Europe, radiocarbon dating places both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens within the same regions for roughly 2,600 to 5,400 years. This was not a sudden replacement, but a prolonged sharing of space, unfolding across landscapes that stretched from what is now France to Central Asia. The terrain they occupied was open and cold, a wide expanse of steppe and tundra where herds moved across long distances. Both groups hunted the same animals: woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, cave bear, and giant deer. These species required coordinated effort to bring down, and the methods used by each group placed them within the same ecological role. The environment did not separate them by function, it placed them in parallel. Shelter followed similar patterns. Caves offered protection from wind and temperature, and both groups used them when available. Fire remained central, providing warmth and light within these enclosed spaces. The daily rhythm of survival moved along similar lines, shaped by the same conditions and the same constraints. Population density remained low across these regions. Estimates suggest that no more than one individual occupied each 10 to 100 square kilometers. With such spacing, encounters between groups may have been infrequent. Months or even years could pass without direct contact, even within shared territories. The presence of both groups in the same region does not imply constant interaction, but rather a pattern of occasional convergence. When contact did occur, it left subtle but measurable traces. In Romania, a skull from Peștera cu Oase, dated between 37,000 and 42,000 years ago, shows features associated with Neanderthals. Genetic analysis indicates that this individual had a Neanderthal ancestor within 4 to 6 generations, a connection recent enough to remain clearly visible. In the Czech Republic, a jaw from Zlatý Kun carries approximately 3% Neanderthal DNA, one of the higher proportions found in ancient Homo sapiens remains. The distribution of these genetic segments reflects repeated interaction, not a single isolated event. At Denisova Cave, a Neanderthal bone contains fragments of Homo sapiens DNA, indicating that the exchange was not one-directional. In the same location, another bone fragment belonged to a young individual whose ancestry was divided between Neanderthal and Denisovan. Her existence shows that interbreeding occurred not only between Homo sapiens and other groups, but also among those groups themselves. These findings indicate that contact was not exclusively hostile. The presence of shared ancestry requires interaction at a level that extends beyond conflict. At the same time, the broader pattern shows a decline in Neanderthal populations during the period when these interactions occurred. The coexistence did not maintain both groups indefinitely. The relationship between these populations cannot be reduced to a single form. It included moments of proximity, exchange, and separation, all occurring within the same span of time. The evidence that remains is fragmentary, yet consistent in showing that boundaries between groups were not absolute. From these encounters, something passed forward that did not disappear with the populations themselves. The traces carried in ancient remains continue into the present, embedded within the genetic structure of living humans, a record that persists without needing physical presence to sustain it. Within the cells of many living people, fragments of older lineages continue to function quietly. For those of non-African descent, between 1 and 4% of the genome traces back to Neanderthals, not as dormant remnants, but as active sequences influencing how the body responds to its environment. These inherited segments are woven into ordinary processes, shaping immunity, physiology, and subtle aspects of variation. Among the most significant contributions are genes related to immune response. Variants of the human leukocyte antigen system, acquired through contact with Neanderthals, expanded the range of pathogens that the immune system can recognize. When early Homo sapiens entered new regions, they encountered microorganisms that had evolved separately from those in Africa. These inherited variants provided an existing framework for defense, allowing recognition and response without requiring entirely new adaptations. Other genes play more specific roles. The STAT2 gene, involved in antiviral responses, carries variants linked to Neanderthal ancestry that remain active in populations across Europe and Asia. Another gene, OAS1, contributes to antiviral defense mechanisms, with certain variants associated with reduced severity in respiratory infections. Studies in recent years have suggested that these effects extend to modern diseases, indicating that ancient genetic exchanges continue to influence present outcomes. Pigmentation also reflects this inheritance. Variants of the MC1R gene, associated with skin and hair characteristics, appear to have contributed to adaptation in regions with lower ultraviolet radiation. These changes affect how the body manages exposure to sunlight, influencing the balance between protection and vitamin production. Not all inherited sequences provide advantage. Some are linked to increased risk in modern contexts. Variants associated with the DISC1 gene show connections to susceptibility in certain neurological conditions, including depression and schizophrenia. Other inherited elements influence blood clotting, raising the likelihood of cardiovascular events under specific conditions. Additional variants are associated with skin responses and metabolic traits that may not align well with contemporary lifestyles. One variant linked to urinary regulation appears to increase urgency, a detail that seems minor but reflects how inherited traits can persist even when they no longer align with current environments. These effects illustrate that inheritance is not selective toward present conditions. It carries forward what once functioned within a different context. Across the genome, there are also regions where Neanderthal DNA is notably absent. These areas suggest that certain combinations of genetic material did not persist, possibly due to incompatibilities that affected development or fertility. Over generations, these segments were reduced or removed, leaving patterns that indicate where integration was limited. Denisovan inheritance presents a more focused set of contributions. In populations living at high altitudes, particularly on the Tibetan Plateau, a variant of the EPAS1 gene allows the body to process oxygen efficiently in low-pressure conditions. Without this adaptation, extended life at such elevations leads to physiological strain. With it, stable populations have persisted in environments that would otherwise be difficult to inhabit. In colder regions, some populations carry Denisovan variants related to fat metabolism, influencing how the body processes and stores energy in low-temperature conditions. These traits remain under study as ongoing research continues to identify additional inherited elements and their effects. The presence of these genes alters how extinction is understood. While the physical forms of these populations are no longer present, their genetic contributions continue to operate within living bodies. They are not visible as separate groups, but their functions remain active, integrated into processes that sustain life across diverse environments. In the late 15th century, ships crossed an ocean and altered the balance of entire continents without a single deliberate act of biological design. Within a century of sustained contact, conservative estimates suggest that half of the indigenous population of the Americas had died from introduced diseases, among them smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza. In some regions, mortality approached 9 out of 10 lives. The scale of loss unfolded quietly at first, carried not by armies alone but by breath, touch, and proximity, moving through communities faster than any visible force. That pattern offers a way to see a far older meeting on the landscape of Eurasia. When Homo sapiens expanded outward tens of thousands of years earlier, they carried with them a biological history shaped by long exposure to African pathogens. Over hundreds of thousands of years, immune systems had been tuned through repeated encounters, building layers of recognition and response. Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans across Asia had followed different paths, shaped by their own microbial worlds, familiar with the illnesses of their regions and unprepared for those that had evolved elsewhere. Contact between these groups created a new exchange, not only of genes and tools but of microorganisms that had never before crossed between them. Viruses and bacteria do not require intention. They move wherever hosts move, adapting to new environments when given the chance. For a population encountering unfamiliar pathogens, the absence of prior exposure means the absence of defenses that take generations to develop. Mathematical models provide a quiet measure of what such an exchange could mean. Even a small increase in annual mortality, as little as 5%, sustained over time without interruption, alters the trajectory of a population. Applied to a group numbering in the tens of thousands, that additional pressure alone, without conflict or environmental change, can lead to gradual disappearance over a span of a few thousand years. The decline would not be sudden, but steady, each generation slightly smaller than the last. Direct traces of this process are difficult to recover. Infectious disease rarely leaves marks on bone, and the soft tissues where pathogens reside do not endure across deep time. Ancient viruses cannot be lifted from most fossil remains, leaving no clear signature of their presence. What remains instead are indirect signals, patterns that suggest interaction without preserving its exact form. Among these signals are the immune genes shared between species. Variants of the HLA system appear to have moved in both directions, indicating that pathogens were not confined within one lineage. Each group encountered unfamiliar challenges, and each carried elements that proved useful to the other. This exchange suggests a landscape where disease flowed alongside contact, shaping outcomes without leaving visible scars. Within such a framework, the decline of Neanderthals and other populations can be understood without the need for direct confrontation. Small, repeated exposures, occurring through shared spaces, overlapping territories, and occasional interaction, could have been sufficient. The carriers would not have recognized themselves as agents of change. Illness would have appeared as part of the natural rhythm of life, not as a force introduced from elsewhere. The parallel with later history is not exact, but the underlying mechanism remains consistent. When populations separated by long distances meet, their biological histories meet as well. The consequences unfold according to patterns that do not depend on awareness or intent. In this way, an unseen exchange may have accompanied every step of expansion, moving silently between groups and leaving its effects in the absence that followed. Across ecosystems, a quiet rule shapes outcomes without announcing itself. When two species draw from the same resources in the same place, their coexistence becomes temporary. Over time, one persists while the other fades, not through a single decisive event, but through an accumulation of small differences that never quite balance. This principle, known as competitive exclusion, operates without intention. It does not require conflict, only overlap. In the long coexistence of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, the overlap was nearly complete. Both moved across the same open landscapes, followed similar herds, and sought shelter in the same protected spaces. Their lives unfolded within shared boundaries, drawing from the same finite systems. Under such conditions, even a slight advantage, repeated across generations, begins to matter in ways that are not immediately visible. One such difference may have been distance. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens developed projectile tools capable of delivering force from afar. Spear throwers extended the reach of the human arm, allowing hunters to strike at ranges measured in tens of meters. Neanderthal tools, by contrast, appear to have favored close engagement, requiring proximity to prey. Over years, the difference between approaching and striking from a distance shapes risk, injury, and survival in subtle ways. Beyond the moment of the hunt, there is the question of connection. Material traces indicate that Homo sapiens groups were linked across wide regions, exchanging stone, pigments, and knowledge over distances that could span hundreds of kilometers. These networks formed pathways through which resources could move when local supplies faltered. A group facing scarcity could draw upon distant relationships, extending its resilience beyond immediate surroundings. Neanderthal communities, while capable and adaptive, appear to have been more localized, their networks narrower in reach. Diet adds another layer to this pattern. Sites associated with Homo sapiens reveal a broader range of food sources, from small animals to aquatic life and plant materials that require different methods of gathering and preparation. This diversity acts as a buffer against change. When one source declines, another remains. In contrast, reliance on large game, while effective in stable conditions, becomes more vulnerable when environments shift and herds move or diminish. Clothing and seasonal adaptation may have contributed as well. The presence of fine bone tools suggests the ability to produce fitted garments, offering insulation that responds closely to the body. In colder intervals, this difference can extend the time a group remains active, allowing movement and foraging under conditions that might otherwise restrict activity. The effect is not dramatic in any single moment, yet it accumulates across seasons. These distinctions do not form a single decisive advantage. Instead, they represent small shifts in probability. If one population experiences even a slight increase in survival or reproduction, as little as one additional individual per 100, the change compounds over generations. Mathematical models show that such a margin, sustained over thousands of years, leads to gradual replacement. The process is quiet, unfolding without abrupt transitions, each generation carrying a barely perceptible difference from the last. Within this framework, disappearance does not require deliberate action. It can emerge from parallel lives lived in the same places, where one group adapts in ways that slightly extend its reach, its resilience, or its continuity. Over long spans of time, those slight extensions accumulate until one presence remains where once there were several. What endures in the record is not a moment of ending, but a thinning, a gradual narrowing of variation until a single lineage continues forward. The word extinction suggests an ending that is clean and final, a boundary beyond which nothing remains. Yet in the quiet evidence of genomes, another pattern appears, one that does not conclude but instead blends, thinning one presence into another until it becomes difficult to say where one lineage ends and the other begins. In this view, disappearance is not always absence. Sometimes it is transformation. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals shared the same regions, their encounters were not limited to distance or avoidance. There were moments of proximity that led to children, and those children carried within them the combined inheritance of both groups. Over time, as these mixed individuals lived, reproduced, and joined larger populations, their genetic contributions spread outward. What began as distinct lineages started to overlap within living bodies. The absorption hypothesis proposes that Neanderthal populations did not vanish through a singular collapse. Instead, they were gradually incorporated into expanding Homo sapiens groups through repeated interbreeding. Each generation carried a fraction of Neanderthal ancestry, and with each passing century, that fraction became smaller, not because it was lost entirely, but because it was diluted within a much larger population. This process follows a simple arithmetic of inheritance. When a smaller group merges with a larger one, its genetic signal is distributed across many descendants. Imagine a population of several thousand individuals meeting another population many times its size. Even if interbreeding continues, each subsequent generation carries a reduced proportion of the smaller group's DNA. Within a span of roughly 1,000 years, that contribution can diminish to a few percent, still present but no longer dominant. Ancient remains preserve snapshots of this transition. Early individuals who lived shortly after periods of contact show higher proportions of Neanderthal ancestry, sometimes several times greater than what is seen today. As time moves forward, those percentages decrease, settling into the narrow range observed in modern populations outside Africa. The pattern aligns with a gradual blending rather than a sudden replacement. The direction of this blending was not balanced. Homo sapiens populations were larger and continued to expand across new territories, while Neanderthal groups appear to have been fewer and more fragmented. In such conditions, the genetic flow moves predominantly one way, from the smaller into the larger, becoming dispersed rather than concentrated. The result is a legacy that persists, yet no longer defines a separate population. There are further details that add texture to this process. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mothers to their children, does not show clear evidence of Neanderthal lineages in living humans. This absence suggests that the pathways of interbreeding may have been uneven, shaped by factors that are still being examined. The patterns recorded in the genome hint at a complex set of interactions, not fully captured by any single explanation. What remains is a distinction between categories. In classification, Homo neanderthalensis is considered extinct, as there are no communities that exist solely within that lineage. In biology, however, elements of that lineage continue to function within the bodies of millions. Genes that once evolved under different skies now operate within a shared inheritance, contributing quietly to traits that persist without drawing attention to their origin. Under this perspective, extinction becomes less absolute. It can describe not only disappearance, but also integration, where the boundaries between groups dissolve and their histories continue in altered form. A fragment no larger than a grape once shifted the boundaries of what could be known. From a cave in Siberia, a child's finger bone revealed a population that had moved across vast stretches of Asia, leaving almost no physical trace behind. Its discovery did not come from a skull resting in sediment or a skeleton arranged in stone, but from sequences hidden within preserved cells. A lineage existed in silence until its presence was read in code. That moment suggests a wider possibility. If an entire human population could remain unseen until such a recent discovery, then absence in the fossil record cannot be taken as absence in history. The record that survives is shaped by chance, by the conditions that allow bone to endure, by the environments that either preserve or erase. What is missing may be as significant as what remains. In genetics, there are patterns that do not align with known sources. When researchers examine the genomes of living populations, they sometimes encounter segments that cannot be traced to Neanderthals, Denisovans, or any other identified group. These segments form a signal without a clear origin. They are described as ghost lineages, populations that once met our ancestors, contributed to their descendants, and then vanished without leaving identifiable remains. Evidence for such lineages appears in West Africa, where studies of present-day populations reveal genetic contributions from an unknown archaic group. The timing of this interbreeding stretches far back, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic distance of this unknown group suggests a branch of humanity distinct from those already mapped. Its contribution is not negligible. In some populations, a notable portion of the genome carries this inherited signal woven into the fabric of living individuals. Yet no fossil has been definitively linked to this lineage. The landscapes where these populations lived offer a possible explanation. Tropical environments, with their heat, moisture, and active soils, break down organic material with efficiency. Bone dissolves, DNA fragments, and the physical traces of life fade quickly. Over long periods, entire populations can pass through such regions without leaving durable evidence behind. Similar hints emerge elsewhere. In parts of the Pacific, genetic patterns suggest contributions from populations related to, yet distinct from, those already identified in Asia. These signals imply encounters with groups that have not been described through physical remains. The human story becomes less a single branching tree and more a network, with connections that appear and disappear across time. Occasionally, known fossils invite speculation. Some researchers have considered whether certain discovered species might correspond to these unseen contributors. Such connections remain uncertain, resting on limited material and incomplete data. The gap between genetic signal and physical form remains, a space where knowledge is partial and evolving. What becomes clear is that the familiar outline of human history is not complete. Each new discovery, whether from stone or from sequence, adds detail to a picture that continues to change. The number of human populations that existed, moved, and interacted is likely greater than the number currently recognized. Some have names and faces reconstructed from bone. Others are known only through the patterns they left within us. In this way, the past is carried forward without full recognition. Within the cells of living people are fragments of histories that have not been fully described, contributions from populations that have no agreed identity. Their presence is real, measurable, and active, even as their forms remain unknown. At the far edge of their long presence, the pattern narrows to a few places where traces linger later than elsewhere. Across much of Europe, sites that once held repeated occupation begin to fall quiet, their sequences ending at different moments, leaving behind a patchwork of absences. What remains is not a single final point, but a gradual retreat toward regions where conditions still offered continuity. As populations of Homo sapiens spread across the continent, Neanderthal groups appear to have contracted toward the southwest, moving into the Iberian Peninsula. This region, with its varied terrain and milder climate, offered a different balance of resources compared to the colder expanses further north. The peninsula extends into the Mediterranean, creating a boundary shaped by water and distance, where movement becomes more contained and encounters less frequent. Along the southern edge of this landscape lies Gibraltar, a narrow meeting of land and sea. Here, a series of caves preserve evidence of late occupation, among them Gorham's Cave, where layers of sediment record human presence extending to approximately 28,000 years ago. The opening of the cave faces the water, and within it are signs of a life oriented toward the shoreline. Remains of mussels, limpets, fish, and marine mammals suggest a familiarity with coastal resources, a shift that reflects adaptation to what remained available. The environment in this final refuge supported continuity, yet it also marked a contraction in range. The broader territories once occupied were no longer part of daily movement. Within the cave, the record shows no decline in capability. Stone tools remain precise, and the evidence of subsistence reflects knowledge carried forward rather than diminished. The presence of carved markings within the bedrock, discovered beneath layers associated with Neanderthal activity and dated to at least 39,000 years ago, adds another dimension. The pattern is deliberate, abstract, and repeated, a form of expression that does not serve a direct practical purpose. Elsewhere in Western Europe, another layer of complexity appears in the archaeological record. The Château-Perronian industry, found in parts of France and northern Spain, presents a mixture of techniques that draw from different traditions. Some of its elements resemble those associated with Homo sapiens, while others align with earlier Neanderthal methods. The origin of this blend remains uncertain. It may represent Neanderthals incorporating new approaches through contact, or it may reflect parallel development within overlapping territories. In either case, the presence of shared elements suggests that knowledge did not remain entirely separate. Within these final enclaves, time continues without a clear boundary marking an end. Layers accumulate, each one representing repeated visits, small changes, and ongoing survival. Then, gradually, the sequence ceases. There is no abrupt disruption preserved in the stone, no singular horizon that indicates a final event. Instead, the layers simply stop, leaving a gap above them that is never filled. The absence that follows is quiet and unmarked. The individuals who lived in these last refuges moved within the rhythms of their environment, responding to immediate needs and conditions without awareness of the broader trajectory. Their presence concludes without record or acknowledgement, preserved only in the materials that remain where they once lived. What endures is the trace of continuity carried to its final point, where a long lineage narrows into a few remaining groups and then passes beyond the reach of the record, leaving behind a silence that is recognized only in retrospect. On an island set apart by water and time, a lineage endured far longer than the measure of our own species so far. The inhabitants of Flores arrived there at least 700,000 years ago, crossing barriers that would have limited many others, then remaining through shifting climates and changing coastlines for hundreds of millennia. Their continuity stretched across a span more than twice the total existence of Homo sapiens, a quiet persistence anchored to a single place. Within that island world, they formed a complete society shaped by constraints that narrowed possibility and, in doing so, defined it. The absence of large mammalian predators created one set of conditions, yet the presence of Komodo dragons introduced another. These reptiles, capable of reaching lengths of 3 meters, moved through the same terrain, imposing a different kind of risk. Survival required awareness and adaptation, not through overwhelming force, but through familiarity with patterns of movement and space. Fire appears in their record as well, in the form of charred bone and ash layers that indicate controlled burning. This suggests not only the ability to produce and maintain flame, but also an understanding of its uses, warmth, protection, and the transformation of food. Around these controlled fires, daily life would have unfolded in rhythms shaped by light and darkness, by gathering and rest. Their hunting practices reveal further complexity. Stegodon, a small relative of elephants, still presented a formidable challenge despite its reduced size. The remains found alongside stone tools indicate cooperative activity, where individuals acted together to bring down prey that could not be managed alone. Such coordination implies communication, shared intention, and the passing of knowledge within groups. These behaviors existed within bodies whose brains were significantly smaller than those of modern humans, suggesting that capability does not map directly onto size alone. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern held. Then, within a comparatively brief interval, it ended. The most recent evidence places their final presence at around 50,000 years ago. This moment aligns with a broader movement of Homo sapiens into the surrounding regions, a convergence in time that invites consideration without providing direct confirmation. No site has yet revealed both populations together, no layer where their tools or remains overlap in a way that marks a clear encounter. Other forces may have shaped the closing of this long chapter. A major volcanic event in the region tens of thousands of years earlier deposited ash across wide areas, altering ecosystems and possibly reducing available resources. Some interpretations suggest that the population on Flores had already begun to contract before the arrival of new groups, their numbers decreasing under pressures that remain only partially understood. Alongside the material record, there are stories carried in the oral traditions of local communities. Descriptions of small, upright beings living within forested areas have been recorded into recent times. These accounts share certain features with what is known from the fossil evidence, though they remain unverified and interpreted with caution. They persist as echoes, not as confirmation, existing alongside the physical traces without merging into them. What ended on Flores was not an isolated curiosity, but a continuous human presence extending across vast stretches of time. A population adapted to its island, shaped by its boundaries, sustained through generations that never left its shores. Their disappearance leaves a gap that is defined not only by absence, but by the duration of what preceded it, a long continuity that concluded without a clear record of its final moment. Beneath every movement traced so far, there is a quieter force that never settled into stillness. Over the last 100,000 years, the background conditions of the planet shifted with a rhythm that was anything but steady. Ice cores drawn from deep within Greenland hold a record of this instability, layers of frozen air marking sudden changes known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events. These were not gradual transitions. Temperatures rose by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within the span of a few human lifetimes, then eased downward again across longer stretches, only to repeat the pattern. At least 25 such oscillations unfolded during the last glacial period, a sequence of abrupt turns unmatched in earlier intervals of similar scale. As these changes accumulated, the surface of the Earth rearranged itself in response. During the last glacial maximum, beginning around 26,500 years ago and easing by 19,000 years ago, ice sheets expanded across vast northern regions. In some areas, they reached thicknesses of 3 to 4 kilometers, pressing down on the land beneath them. Water drawn into these frozen masses lowered global sea levels by as much as 120 to 135 meters. Coastlines shifted outward, revealing corridors that no longer exist. Where there is now open water between Britain and mainland Europe, a continuous stretch of land once extended, known as Doggerland. To the north of the Pacific, Siberia and Alaska were joined across Beringia, forming a broad passage between continents. Farther south, the islands of Southeast Asia were linked by the exposed Sunda Shelf, reshaping the geography of regions that had once been fragmented. These connections appeared and disappeared as ice advanced and retreated, altering routes of movement and access to resources in cycles that no single generation could fully anticipate. Within this shifting framework, survival became tied to flexibility. Each climatic swing redistributed what could be found and where it could be found. Areas that supported life during one phase could become inhospitable within decades, while other regions opened briefly as viable habitats before closing again. Species that could adjust their behavior, shift their diets, or move across expanding distances were more likely to persist through these transitions. Those more closely tied to specific environments faced a narrowing set of options as conditions changed around them. Neanderthals had already endured earlier glacial cycles, adapting repeatedly to cold environments and fluctuating landscapes. What distinguished this later period was the presence of another human population occupying overlapping territories. The environmental pressures did not act in isolation. Instead, they intersected with other forces that were already shaping population dynamics. When climate stress, competition, and disease are considered together, their combined effect becomes more difficult to separate into individual causes. Each factor alone may have been within the range that a population could withstand. Acting simultaneously, they could reduce resilience to the point where recovery became unlikely. The margin between persistence and disappearance narrowed with each added strain. The timing of these changes carried its own influence. A population situated in a region that remained productive during a rapid warming event might experience growth, while another, located in a newly arid or frozen zone, might decline sharply within the same interval. As conditions reversed, the roles could shift. The outcome depended not only on inherent capabilities, but also on position at specific moments when numbers were already low. Across these cycles, survival did not follow a fixed path. It was shaped by movement, by adaptation, and by circumstance that changed repeatedly over spans of a few thousand years. The places that offered continuity at one time could lose it in the next, and the balance between endurance and disappearance was continually renegotiated within a world that refused to remain the same. Seen from a distance wide enough to hold entire continents at once, the pattern resolves into something stark and simple. Around 100,000 years ago, the genus Homo did not belong to a single form. At least 6 distinct human species occupied different regions of the Earth at the same time, each shaped by its own history, each moving through landscapes in ways adapted to its own body and mind. By 28,000 years ago, that diversity had narrowed to one. The sequence does not unfold as a single collapse, but as a series of quiet endings distributed across space. In southern Africa, Homo naledi leaves behind remains dated to roughly 236,000 years ago, its disappearance occurring before the later movements that would reshape the rest of the story. In Southeast Asia, Homo erectus persists in Java until about 108,000 years ago, a lineage that had endured for nearly 1.9 million years, contracting into an island refuge before fading from the record. Further east, the traces of Homo luzonensis appear in the Philippines between roughly 50,000 and 67,000 years ago, then cease within the same span that marks the arrival of new populations in the region. On the island of Flores, Homo floresiensis follows a similar timeline, its last known presence also ending around 50,000 years ago. In Siberia, Denisovan remains extend to approximately 48,000 years ago, their physical record confined to a small number of fragments, even as their genetic legacy suggests a much broader range. In Western Europe, Homo neanderthalensis persists longest, with evidence continuing until about 28,000 years ago in the southern edge of the continent. Placed side by side, these endpoints form a pattern that compresses across a relatively brief geological interval. Over roughly 40,000 years, species that had existed for hundreds of thousands, and in some cases more than 1 million, disappear from the fossil record. The timing of these disappearances aligns, region by region, with the expansion of a single remaining lineage into territories that had long been occupied. The relationship between these events requires careful framing. Correlation does not establish a single cause, and the record preserves only fragments of what unfolded. Yet when a similar pattern repeats across multiple continents, involving multiple species within a limited span of time, it draws attention to the possibility of a shared underlying dynamic. The alignment is not perfect, but it is consistent enough to resist dismissal. As each population diminishes, the ecological structure of the genus Homo shifts. For at least 2 million years, different human species had occupied overlapping and adjacent niches, each interacting with environments in distinct ways. Some specialized in particular climates or prey, others developed different strategies for survival across variable conditions. With each disappearance, one of these approaches is removed, and the range of human variation narrows. By the end of this sequence, that process reaches completion. The genus Homo becomes represented by a single species, occupying all regions where human life persists. Every niche that can sustain a human presence is now filled by one lineage, carrying with it a specific set of biological traits and behavioral capacities. The diversity that once existed across multiple forms is no longer distributed among separate species. What remains is a record marked by absence. The fossil layers that once held different human forms become uniform in their contents. Genetic traces persist in altered fragments within living populations, But the distinct combinations that defined those earlier species are no longer present as complete entities. The world that follows contains only one version of what it means to be human, moving forward through environments that had once been shared among many. From the small band that moved beyond the African continent, another narrowing quietly took shape, layered upon the earlier contraction that had already reduced human variation. The group that crossed into the Arabian Peninsula is estimated, through genetic modeling, to have consisted of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 individuals, with some reconstructions allowing for even fewer. Within that limited number, only those capable of reproduction would carry forward the entire future of every population that would arise beyond Africa. As movement continued, a pattern repeated itself in successive steps. Small groups separated from the larger body and established themselves in new regions. Each of these departures carried only a portion of the genetic diversity present in the group they left behind. This process, known as the serial founder effect, did not remove variation in a deliberate way. It simply followed the logic of sampling, where each new population began as a subset drawn from a subset. Over time, the cumulative effect of these separations reduced diversity further with each expansion. The traces of this process remain visible across the global distribution of genetic variation today. Populations in sub-Saharan Africa retain the highest levels of diversity, reflecting a longer and more continuous history without repeated outward sampling. Moving northward and eastward, diversity becomes more constrained. In regions such as North Africa and the Middle East, it is slightly reduced, while in Europe and East Asia it narrows further. Among indigenous populations of the Americas, the reduction is most pronounced. These populations descend from groups that crossed into the Americas approximately 15,000 years ago, themselves already shaped by earlier migrations and bottlenecks. This gradient carries practical consequences that extend into the present. Much of modern genetic research has focused on populations of European ancestry, which represent only a portion of human diversity and one that has passed through multiple reductions. Medical insights derived from these studies can reflect patterns specific to that subset, while variations present in other populations remain less understood. Certain genetic variants linked to disease risk or response to treatment are found primarily in African populations and have yet to be fully explored, leaving gaps in knowledge that reflect the uneven distribution of research as much as the distribution of genes. Alongside this reduction, the populations moving outward also carried genetic material acquired through contact with other human species encountered along their path. In regions near the Middle East, interbreeding introduced segments of Neanderthal DNA into the expanding population. As groups continued through parts of Asia, additional genetic contributions from Denisovan populations became incorporated. These fragments were then passed along through each subsequent migration, embedded within the genomes of populations that would move far beyond the regions where those encounters occurred. By the time humans reached distant areas, such as the Americas, these inherited elements were already part of their biological inheritance. The individuals who crossed into those lands did not meet Neanderthals or Denisovans themselves, yet they carried traces of those earlier encounters within their DNA. Each migration step transmitted not only a reduced sample of genetic diversity, but also the accumulated history of interactions that had occurred along the way. In this layered process, expansion and reduction unfolded together. Movement into new territories created the global distribution of human populations, while the repeated narrowing of genetic variation shaped the structure within those populations. The result is a pattern that reflects both the reach of human migration and the constraints imposed by the small groups that carried it forward. A record written in the distribution of variation across the living world. At the center of this long unfolding, the question settles without urgency, as if it has been waiting quietly beneath each preceding step. The difference, if there was one, does not present itself as a single trait or a clear dividing line. Instead, it appears as a pattern that only becomes visible when many threads are viewed together, and even then, it resists a simple explanation. One thread runs through the accumulation of knowledge. In some populations, techniques and ideas did not vanish with the individuals who first used them. They were carried forward, preserved, and altered slightly with each passing generation. This process, often described as cumulative culture, allows change to build gradually without returning to earlier states. A shaped stone becomes a refined tool, which becomes part of a broader set of practices. Over long stretches of time, this creates a quiet layering of innovation. The record associated with Homo sapiens suggests a pattern where such layering continued and expanded, with variation increasing rather than remaining fixed. Another thread lies in the scale of connection between groups. Materials found far from their geological sources indicate movement or exchange across distances that extend beyond immediate surroundings. This implies contact maintained over wider areas, where information and resources could circulate rather than remain confined. Such networks do not need to be large in any single moment to have lasting effects. Even occasional contact can introduce new methods or ideas into a group where they can be retained and adapted. Over time, this creates a web of shared knowledge that extends beyond any one place. Language, though not preserved directly in the physical record, can be approached through its effects. The coordination required for complex tasks, the creation of objects that hold symbolic meaning, and the planning of actions that unfold over extended periods all suggest a system of communication capable of conveying more than immediate needs. Whether this system differed in structure or capacity from that of other human species remains uncertain, but the behaviors associated with it indicate a level of abstraction and shared understanding that supported increasingly complex interactions. Alongside these differences, there are areas where distinction becomes less clear. The evidence associated with Neanderthals reveals forms of care, adaptation, and symbolic activity that align closely with what is observed in Homo sapiens. Their bodies reflect strength and endurance suited to their environments, while their practices indicate familiarity with their surroundings, developed over long periods. These observations suggest that in many respects, the cognitive and emotional capacities of different human species may have overlapped significantly. The role of circumstance becomes more visible when these elements are considered together. The advantages associated with cumulative culture or extended networks do not operate in isolation. They become meaningful within specific conditions, where the ability to adapt quickly or draw on distant resources can influence survival. In environments that shift rapidly, such flexibility can offer stability where other strategies falter. In more stable conditions, different adaptations might hold equal or greater value. The outcome that followed does not resolve into inevitability. It reflects an alignment between certain capabilities and a particular set of environmental pressures unfolding at a specific time. The features that proved advantageous were not universally superior in all contexts, but they were suited to the circumstances in which they were applied. Within that alignment, one lineage persisted while others did not, leaving behind traces that continue to shape the present in subtle ways. When the last parallel line fades from the record, the landscape does not remain unchanged. By around 28,000 years ago, one human species occupies the full range of environments that can sustain it, extending across Africa, Europe, Asia, and into distant continents reached through successive movements. Only Antarctica and scattered islands far out in the Pacific remain beyond this reach. The presence is widespread, but the balance that follows is not static. Across different regions, the disappearance of large animals begins to appear with a pattern that aligns with this expansion. In Africa, where human populations and large fauna had existed together for long spans of time, many species persist. The animals there had encountered human hunters across countless generations, and their behavior reflects an awareness shaped by that history. In Eurasia, some losses occur, yet a number of large species continue into later periods, their survival uneven, but not entirely interrupted. Further from these long-standing interactions, the changes become more pronounced. In Australia, after human arrival, a large proportion of sizable mammals vanishes within a relatively brief interval. Among them are Diprotodon, an herbivore of considerable size, along with forms of giant kangaroos and other distinctive marsupials. A large flightless bird, known as Genyornis, also disappears during this time, along with predators adapted to prey on animals no longer present. A similar sequence unfolds in the Americas. Within a span estimated at 1,000 to 2,000 years following human arrival, numerous large mammals cease to appear in the fossil record. Species such as woolly mammoths and mastodons are among those lost, along with giant ground sloths and large predators that had occupied their own roles within those ecosystems. The timing varies by region, but the alignment between human presence and faunal decline repeats with notable consistency. This pattern does not point to a single cause that can be isolated with certainty. Climate shifts continue to influence environments, and the interactions between species are complex. Yet the repeated association between expansion into new territories and the reduction of large animal populations suggests a connection that extends beyond coincidence alone. In regions where animals had not developed responses to human predation, the impact appears more immediate. As these changes accumulate, the structure of ecosystems shifts in response. Large animals that once influenced vegetation, soil distribution, and the movement of nutrients are no longer present in the same numbers or not present at all. Their absence alters the relationships between plants and smaller animals, reshaping patterns that had developed over much longer periods. The effects are not confined to a single location, but extend across continents, creating a new configuration of life that differs from what came before. Within this emerging world, human populations continue to grow and adapt. The removal of other human species removes one form of competition, allowing expansion into niches that had previously been shared. This expansion, in turn, increases interaction with other species, amplifying pressures already in motion. The result is not a steady equilibrium, but a sequence of adjustments that follow one another, each building upon earlier changes. By around 10,000 years ago, new practices begin to appear in multiple regions, including the cultivation of plants and the management of animals. These developments take place in a world already shaped by earlier losses. The landscapes, often considered natural, are, in many cases, the outcome of these prior transformations, carrying within them the absence of species that once played central roles. The widest range of human variation does not lie at the edges of the map, but at the point where the story began. Across the African continent, the genetic differences carried by living populations exceed those found across all other regions combined. This is not an abstract measure drawn from distant comparisons. It reflects a continuity of presence extending across roughly 300,000 years, during which lineages remained divided and recombined within the same broad landscape. Each movement outward from this origin carried only part of what existed within it. When small groups left, they did not take the full range of variation with them. They carried a selection shaped by chance, by who was present, and by who continued. As migrations continued, each new population began from a narrower base than the one before. The result is a pattern where diversity decreases with distance from the source, not because variation was lost intentionally, but because it was never fully carried forward. Within Africa itself, this depth of variation becomes more apparent when examined closely. Among populations in the southern regions, often referred to as the San or Khoisan, the genetic lineages extend back further than those found anywhere else. Their ancestors diverged from other human populations around 200,000 years ago, creating branches that have remained distinct over long spans of time. Within these groups, the differences between individuals can exceed those observed between populations separated by continents elsewhere in the world. This depth is not confined to one region. In West Africa, genetic studies have revealed traces of interactions with human groups that have not yet been identified through fossils. These contributions, referred to as ghost lineages, appear in the genomes of populations such as the Yoruba, Mende, and Asan. The individuals who carry these segments live without any visible sign of their origin, yet within their cells are fragments of encounters that occurred tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago with forms of humanity that remain unnamed. The distribution of this variation has implications that extend beyond historical reconstruction. Modern medical research often relies on identifying links between genetic variation and disease, as well as responses to treatment. However, a large proportion of these studies have focused on populations of European ancestry, which represent a narrower portion of the overall human genetic spectrum. As a result, many variants present in African populations have not been examined with the same level of detail. Some of these variants relate to conditions shaped by long-term environmental pressures, including those associated with infectious diseases. Others influence how the body processes medications or responds to therapies. When data derived from one subset of humanity is applied broadly, it can overlook differences that affect outcomes in populations whose genetic backgrounds have not been equally studied. The gap reflects not a lack of importance, but a difference in attention. The situation forms a contrast that becomes more pronounced when considered alongside the broader narrative. The continent that holds the deepest record of human history, where the widest range of variation continues to exist, is also the place where much of that variation remains least explored in certain scientific contexts. Within this contrast lies a reminder that the understanding of human biology is shaped not only by what is present, but by where focus is placed and where it has yet to settle. Among the branching patterns of life, most lineages do not narrow to a single thread. They spread, divide, and persist in parallel forms, each adapting in its own direction while sharing a common ancestry. In many genera, multiple species occupy overlapping worlds at the same time. The great apes offer a familiar example, with chimpanzees and bonobos living today as distinct yet related expressions of the same lineage. Gorillas exist in separate species as well, each inhabiting different regions, Even within the genus Canis, wolves, coyotes, and jackals move across landscapes as variations on a shared design. Against this pattern, the genus Homo stands alone, reduced to one surviving form. This singularity is not the default state of a successful lineage. It is the outcome of a sequence of reductions, each narrowing the range of variation until only one branch remained. The absence is not immediately visible in the present moment, yet it shapes the frame through which human identity is understood. Without other human species alongside us, there is no direct comparison, no neighboring form that reflects both similarity and difference in equal measure. If other hominids had persisted into the present, the way human uniqueness is described would likely rest on different ground. The qualities often considered defining, such as symbolic thought, complex tools, and social organization, would not belong exclusively to a single species. They would appear instead as shared characteristics distributed across multiple forms of humanity. The boundary between human and non-human would remain, but within that boundary there would be variation, a spectrum rather than a single point. In such a world, the question of what it means to be human would carry a different weight. It would not point outward toward contrast with all other life, but inward toward distinctions within a broader category. The presence of another human species would make visible the range of possible expressions of cognition and culture, each grounded in a different evolutionary path, yet recognizable as part of the same continuum. The search for intelligence beyond Earth offers a distant parallel. Telescopes scan the sky for signals that might indicate another thinking presence. While on this planet, within the recent span of geological time, such presences existed in multiple forms. Their disappearance has left a silence that is easy to overlook because it is complete. There is no living reference point, no surviving population to remind us of what once coexisted with us. Each of those vanished lineages carried its own way of engaging with the world. Perception, memory, attention, and social understanding would have been shaped by different bodies and histories. These differences were not recorded in language that could be preserved, nor in systems that could be translated. They existed within individuals and groups, and when those groups ended, the perspectives they held ended with them. What remains is a single version of human experience, expanded across the globe, yet rooted in one surviving lineage. The diversity that exists within it is real and substantial, but it does not include the alternative architectures of mind that once existed alongside it. The absence of those alternatives creates a kind of quiet, one that is not defined by emptiness in space, but by the narrowing of possibility within a category that was once broader. In this way, the condition of being the only species in the genus carries a subtle implication. It is not only a marker of survival, but also a record of reduction. The world contains one form of human life, and within that fact lies the trace of many others that are no longer present, their differences unobservable, their presence inferred only through fragments that remain. It can be traced not to a single turning point, but to a sequence that only resolves when every element is present at once. Each piece appears small when held on its own, yet the pattern only holds together because none of them were missing. What remains is not a straight line of progress, but a narrow path shaped by conditions that aligned without intention. The first element rests along a particular stretch of shoreline in southern Africa, where cold ocean currents moderated extremes that reshaped much of the surrounding world. The waters that moved northward carried nutrients that fed dense bands of marine life along the coast. Shellfish clung to rocks in the intertidal zone, replenishing with each cycle of tides. Inland, plant life remained varied and reliable, even as broader ecosystems faltered. This combination created a place where continuity was possible during a period when continuity was rare. The persistence of a small population depended on this stability, not in abstract terms, but in daily access to food that did not disappear. From that foothold, another alignment followed, measured not in terrain but in timing. Sea levels, lowered by vast quantities of water held in ice, revealed stretches of land that no longer exist. Shorelines extended outward, forming corridors that connected regions once separated by water. These passages did not remain open indefinitely. As conditions shifted, they closed again beneath rising seas. Movement across them depended on arriving within a specific interval, neither too early nor too late. The migration that carried a small group beyond its original range unfolded within that interval, along routes that have since been submerged. As these populations entered new environments, they encountered other human groups whose histories were rooted in those regions. Contact did not occur as a single event, but as repeated interactions across generations. Through these encounters, genetic material passed between populations. Among the inherited variations were changes to immune system function that expanded recognition of unfamiliar pathogens. Without those additions, exposure to new disease environments might have imposed a different outcome on small migrant groups already limited in number. Further east, another exchange left a more specific imprint. Within the genetic inheritance of certain populations, a variant associated with oxygen regulation at high altitude appears. This variant traces back to contact with a Denisovan population. Its presence allows sustained life in environments where oxygen is scarce, reducing physiological strain that would otherwise limit settlement. This capacity opened regions that would have remained marginal, extending the range of where human populations could persist. Alongside these biological exchanges, a different form of change emerged within behavior itself. The accumulation of techniques, symbols, and shared practices began to build across generations without resetting. Knowledge was not only preserved, it was extended. This continuity allowed small advantages to compound, shaping how groups adapted to shifting conditions. It did not operate as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual increase in the ability to retain and refine what had been learned. None of these elements function independently. Remove the coastal stability, and the initial population contracts beyond recovery. Shift the timing of lowered seas, and the passage outward closes. Remove the inherited immune variations, and survival in unfamiliar environments becomes less likely. Without the capacity to sustain culture across generations, adaptation slows in ways that matter over long spans of time. Taken together, these alignments form a chain in which each link depends on the others. The outcome that followed is not explained by any single factor, nor by an inherent direction within evolution. It is the result of conditions that converged, briefly and precisely, allowing one lineage to continue where others did not. There is a continuity that does not announce itself, a line that has never broken, though it has narrowed, split, and recombined across vast spans of time. Each living person exists because every generation before them succeeded in passing something forward. The chain stretches back through migrations and contractions, through periods when survival depended on small groups holding together, through earlier forms whose names are now known only through fragments. It is not an abstract lineage, but a direct sequence of lives, each connected to the next without interruption. To reach the present moment, this sequence passed through points where continuation was uncertain, populations reduced to small numbers, landscapes that offered only limited refuge, and movements that depended on precise conditions all form part of that path. none of those intervals allowed for redundancy. The loss of a single branch in the chain would have ended that particular line. The persistence of any one individual today implies that every one of those earlier transitions resolved in a way that allowed continuation. Within the body, this continuity appears as a composite. Genetic material carries traces of multiple sources layered over time through contact between populations. For those whose ancestry includes populations that moved beyond Africa, a portion of the genome reflects inheritance from Neanderthal groups. These segments are not inert. They contribute to immune responses, to variations in skin and physiology, and to processes that operate continuously without awareness. In certain high-altitude regions, the ability to function in low-oxygen environments is supported by a specific genetic variant that entered the human lineage through contact with a Denisovan population. This variation alters how the body regulates hemoglobin, allowing efficient oxygen use without the complications that arise in individuals lacking it. The presence of this trait reflects a moment of contact preserved across thousands of generations. In populations across parts of Oceania, a larger proportion of Denisovan ancestry remains, integrated into the genome at levels higher than in any other region. These inherited elements influence metabolic pathways and immune responses, shaping how the body interacts with its environment. They are distributed unevenly across populations, reflecting the paths taken by different groups as they moved through diverse landscapes. Beyond the named lineages, genetic analyses reveal contributions from sources that have not yet been matched to known species. These ghost lineages appear as segments of DNA that diverge from all identified archaic groups. Their presence indicates encounters with populations that left no confirmed fossils, yet contributed to the genetic composition of living people. These traces persist without a corresponding image of the individuals who carried them. The inheritance is not limited to biological function. Some researchers propose that patterns of social behavior may reflect conditions faced during periods when group cohesion was essential for survival. The reliance on close social bonds, the sensitivity to exclusion, and the need for cooperation are often examined in this context. While such interpretations remain under study, the alignment between these traits and the demands of small, interdependent populations is notable. What emerges is not a single origin, but an accumulation. Each person represents a convergence of multiple histories carried within the same organism. The elements that compose this inheritance were shaped in different places, under different conditions, and at different times, yet they coexist within a unified structure. The result is a mosaic, assembled through continuity and contact, where each component retains a connection to its origin while contributing to the whole. The events that shaped this composition are not separate from the present. They are embedded within it, active and ongoing, expressed in ways that link current lives to a sequence that extends far beyond direct memory. Consider the span of time each lineage carried before it reached its end, not as isolated fragments in sediment, but as continuous presences that moved, adapted, and persisted across landscapes that no longer exist in the same form. Each of them occupied the world fully while they were here, shaped by pressures and possibilities that produced distinct ways of living. Homo neanderthalensis endured for roughly 400,000 years, a duration that included repeated shifts in climate that reconfigured entire regions. Their bodies bore the marks of those conditions. Their culture developed within them, and their survival extended through cycles that would have erased less resilient populations. Evidence shows care for injured individuals, controlled use of fire, and patterns that indicate symbolic behavior. Their final presence is recorded in the far southwestern edge of Europe, where occupation layers in Gibraltar cease around 28,000 years ago. After that point, the record does not continue. The Denisovans occupied a range that stretched across much of Asia, from high northern latitudes to regions near the Pacific. Their existence is known primarily through genetic traces and a small number of physical remains, including fragments from a cave in Siberia. From these limited sources, a broader picture emerges through the DNA they contributed to later populations. Variants associated with adaptation to high-altitude environments and immune responses persist in living people. The individuals themselves, who carried those traits in their original context, are no longer present. On the island of Flores, a separate lineage maintained continuity for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo floresiensis lived within a bounded environment, adapting to its constraints and opportunities. Their archaeological record shows tool use, controlled fire, and cooperative behavior in hunting. Their presence extends across a long span before ending approximately 50,000 years ago. The continuity that had persisted for so long does not extend beyond that point. Homo luzonensis is known from remains found in a cave on Luzon, dated to a similar period. The available evidence consists of teeth and small bones, indicating a population with a combination of anatomical features not seen together elsewhere. The record is limited, and much about their behavior and range remains unknown. Their presence appears briefly in the archaeological sequence, then does not continue. Beyond these identified groups, genetic studies indicate the existence of additional lineages that have not been matched to specific fossils. These ghost populations contributed genetic material to modern humans, yet left no clear physical record that can be assigned to them with certainty. Their existence is inferred through patterns in DNA that diverge from known groups. The individuals who carried those sequences lived, interacted, and reproduced, but their forms are not preserved in a way that allows reconstruction. With each of these lineages, what ended was not only a biological population, but a set of behaviors, perceptions, and interactions shaped by unique histories. The ways in which they interpreted their environments, the structures of their social groups, and the forms of knowledge they developed were specific to each lineage. These elements were not transferred in their entirety to any surviving group. The term extinction describes the absence that follows, yet it does not capture the full scope of what is no longer present. The disappearance includes patterns of thought and experience that cannot be recovered once the last individuals are gone. What remains are traces, partial and indirect, from which a broader understanding can be assembled, though never fully restored. Across distant valleys and along forgotten ridgelines, there were once many points of light. Each marked a gathering, a circle of figures shaped by different histories, speaking in voices that carried meanings no longer heard. The fires were separate, yet part of the same broader presence, scattered across continents that held more than one way of being human at the same time. At one point in that long sequence, nearly all of those lights dimmed. Around 70,000 years ago, the number of surviving individuals was reduced to a scale that would now fit within a small community. Along a stretch of southern coastline, people moved with the rhythm of tides, collecting what the sea provided, living within a narrow margin where continuation remained possible. The conditions surrounding them did not favor persistence, yet persistence occurred, quietly and without recognition. Those individuals did not perceive themselves as central to any larger outcome. They were not aware of parallel populations fading elsewhere, nor of the lineages that would not continue. They did not know that within their bodies were fragments inherited from encounters that had already taken place, nor that future encounters would add to that inheritance. Their actions were immediate, grounded in daily needs, with no sense of the scale their survival would later represent. From that point forward, the sequence did not break. Generation followed generation, each carrying forward the accumulated result of earlier events. Through shifts in climate that altered landscapes, through movements that extended across new regions, and through interactions with other human groups, the line continued. It did not persist through any single mechanism, but through the combined effect of many conditions aligning in ways that allowed continuity. This continuity extends, without interruption, from those early populations to the present. Every individual now alive is connected to that sequence, not as an abstract concept, but through direct biological descent. The passage of time did not sever the line, it lengthened it, adding layer upon layer of inherited material and experience. The result is a structure that contains within it traces of each stage through which it has passed. Within that structure, elements from earlier encounters remain active. Variations introduced through contact with Neanderthal populations contribute to immune responses in living people. Genetic segments associated with Denisovan ancestry support adaptation to specific environments, including high-altitude regions where oxygen is limited. Additional fragments, derived from populations that have not been identified through fossils, persist without a clear origin, yet continue to function within the genome. These components are not separate additions, they are integrated into the whole. They influence processes that operate continuously, shaping how the body interacts with its surroundings. Their presence is a direct link to events that occurred across different times and places, preserved through the mechanism of inheritance. The continuity of the line does not imply awareness within it. The individuals who carried it forward did not recognize its significance. They acted within the scope of their immediate circumstances, passing forward what they had received without knowing the extent of what was being preserved. The result of those actions is visible only when viewed across the full span of time. What remains now is a single, continuous lineage that contains within it the distributed traces of others. The fires that once existed in multiple forms are no longer separate, yet their influence persists in fragments carried forward. The presence of those fragments within living bodies reflects a history that has not been erased, but transformed into a composite that continues to operate in the present. Time has continued its quiet movement, carrying the present far beyond the last traces of those who once shared this world. Roughly 28,000 years have passed since the final Neanderthals. Around 50,000 years separate now from the last Denisovans and from the final inhabitants of Flores. The interval is vast, not only in years, but in the depth of silence it contains. What once existed in parallel has long since faded, leaving no living counterpart to observe. Within that extended quiet, one lineage expanded without interruption. It moved across continents, adapted to climates that ranged from equatorial heat to polar cold, and gradually transformed its surroundings. Settlements grew into cities. Spoken sounds became written systems, and knowledge accumulated in forms that could persist beyond individual memory. Eventually, tools were built that could examine the smallest components of life, and machines were sent outward into space, tracing paths far beyond the atmosphere that had shaped every earlier step. Only recently has that same lineage turned its attention fully backward toward the layers of earth that hold the remains of those who came before. Fragments of bone, traces of tools, and sequences of DNA have begun to reveal a picture that was not previously understood. The recognition that other human forms once existed alongside this one is not ancient knowledge. It is a discovery still unfolding, assembled piece by piece as new evidence emerges. Some of these insights are very recent. The identification of Denisovans came from a fragment so small it could fit in the palm of a hand. Genetic signals pointing to unknown lineages have been detected only within the last few years. The broader structure of human history, including the interactions between different groups and the contributions they made to one another, is still incomplete. What is known continues to change as new findings are added. This emerging understanding carries an implication that reshapes how the present is viewed. The condition of being the only surviving human species is not the long-standing norm it might appear to be. For much of the time that Homo sapiens has existed, there were others. They lived in adjacent regions, sometimes in overlapping territories, close enough for contact and exchange. Their absence now is the result of processes that are only partly understood, involving combinations of environment, interaction, and chance. The awareness of that absence does not come with a defined response. The scientific record describes what can be measured and inferred, but it does not assign meaning beyond those observations. The knowledge that multiple human lineages once coexisted and that only one remains stands without an accompanying directive. It is a fact that persists, independent of interpretation. The continuity of the surviving lineage extends from those early populations to the present moment. It has not been interrupted, and it has not reversed. The same process that carried it through periods of extreme vulnerability now supports a global presence that reaches into nearly every environment on Earth. The scale has changed, but the underlying continuity remains the same. The earlier diversity of human forms is no longer visible in the living world. What remains is a single expression, carrying within it traces of those that came before, but not their full presence. The fires that once marked multiple groups across different landscapes are no longer separate points of light. There is now one continuous flame, sustained across time, moving forward without parallel. It has persisted through conditions that might have ended it, and it continues without pause. It remains.